If it's Wednesday, the nation's top national security chiefs testify before Congress, warning of China's growing cyber and military threat, even as Beijing seeks to stabilize its relationship with the U.S. and the West. Plus, Republican riffs and rebukes. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy defends his decision to release unseen January 6 footage to a propagandist, Tucker Carlson, as the Republican Party once again faces the toxic and divisive forces that fueled and then excused the insurrection. And Congress, crime and policing. The Senate gears up to block a D.C. crime bill, and the Attorney General reveals new damning findings on rampant problems within the Louisville Police Department, nearly 3 years after the botched raid that killed Breonna Taylor. Happy Wednesday. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Chuck Todd reporting here in Washington, where the threat China poses to our national security and our economy was once again the spotlight on Capitol Hill today in the annual Worldwide Threats hearing. The leaders of the U.S. intelligence community testified that Beijing remains the greatest threat to the United States. Here's Avril Haines, the Director of National Intelligence.
Needless to say, the People's Republic of China, which is increasingly challenging the United States economically, technologically, politically, and militarily around the world, remains our unparalleled priority. We assess that during the course of Xi's third term, they will together attempt to press Taiwan on unification, undercut U.S. influence, which they perceive as a threat, and drive wedges between Washington and its allies and partners, and promote certain norms that favor China's authoritarian system.
Of course, in a sign of just how complicated our relationship with China is, Haines also told the committee Beijing is seeking a better relationship with Washington.
We assess that Beijing still believes it benefits most by preventing a spiraling of tensions and by preserving stability in its relationship with the United States. And specifically, Beijing wants to preserve stability in East Asia, avoid triggering additional economic punishments from U.S. sanctions and U.S. partners, and showcase a steady relationship with the United States to help avoid setbacks in its other relationships around the world.
And in concert with today's hearing, the intel community also released its annual threat assessment, which outlines the threats posed by China, as well as Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and yes, climate change. The assessment notes that China is getting more aggressive in its efforts to influence state and local American politics. That's fascinating. All of this comes a month after the U.S. shot down a Chinese spy balloon that had crossed into the continental United States, just as officials are warning that China may be prepared to provide Vladimir Putin and Russia with lethal aid in its war in Ukraine. And as Congress considers legislation that could lead to a ban on Chinese-owned TikTok, here was Vice Chair Marco Rubio's exchange with FBI Director Christopher Wray.
Could the Chinese government, through its ownership of ByteDance, that owns ByteDance U.S., if they wanted to, and ByteDance U.S. were willing to cooperate or forced to cooperate, could they use TikTok to control data on millions of users?
Yes.
Could they use it to control the software on millions of devices, given the opportunity to do so?
Yes.
Could they use it to drive narratives, like to divide Americans against each other? Or, for example, let's say China wants to invade Taiwan, to make sure that Americans are seeing videos arguing why Taiwan belongs to China and why the U.S. should not intervene?
Yes.
As for the war in Ukraine, in its published report, the intelligence community collectively states that, quote, Russia probably does not want a direct military conflict with the United States and NATO forces, but there is potential for that to occur. Also today, the Washington Post and New York Times are reporting that intelligence officials believe that pro-Ukrainian saboteurs may have been behind the bombings of the Nord Stream pipeline last September. NBC News has not confirmed that reporting, and the Pentagon and National Security Office have both pushed back a bit on that reporting, kind of, sort of. We'll get into it in a few minutes. But joining me now on set is our Justice Intelligence correspondent Ken Delanian. Courtney Cubie is at the Pentagon. I'm also joined by Shane Harris, whose reporting was behind that, the intelligence national security reporter for the Washington Post. We'll get a lot to get into. But Ken, let me start with you. And it's sort of balancing act that it was pretty clear that the intel community wants Washington to be focused on all things China. Like, it feels like the point of these worldwide threat hearings is, okay, here's what the intel community thinks you, Congress, need to be focused on. Now, Congress thinks it's asking the questions, but in many ways they're forcing this conversation. It felt like this was a forced focus on China by the intel community.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. I mean, we lived in a world where for years and years the focus was Iraq, Afghanistan, the war on terror.
Is the word ISIS, by the way, anywhere in this threat assessment? Isn't it fascinating how quickly that's gone?
Yeah, it's amazing. Anyway. It's remarkable. And that,
Afghanistan is a small little part of this, if at all.
And not that there aren't operations ongoing against ISIS terrorists. There are, but the focus is really on China because it's a bipartisan consensus, obviously, that China is posing a multi-dimensional threat. And the good news out of this was that Avril Haines said that President Xi wants stability right now. It's in his interest to not push things too hard.
I think the other insight here is that they're trying to persuade. And if they think they've lost Washington, which, by the way, that's sort of the mindset of TikTok. They think Washington's a lost cause. Maybe we can do better in state capitals. And it seems like the Chinese government thinks this, too.
That was one of the most remarkable parts of this written assessment. I've never seen it put this starkly before. The intel agencies essentially said China is trying to influence U.S. politics, but they feel like Washington's a lost cause, Washington's against them, so they're concentrating on state and local officials, which they view as more pliable. That was the word used. And you may ask, well, how are they trying to influence state and local officials? Lots of different ways. Covert social media campaigns, spies in their offices, but mainly economic coercion.
I was just going to say, it's mostly financial, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Hey, we can bring a factory here. Hey, 100%. We can do this. That sort of thing.
And that's hard for state and local officials to resist.
There was a big scoop in the Canadian papers about a week ago, I think Canadian intelligence, that the Chinese were meddling in their election. Basically, they didn't want the conservatives in power, but they wanted Trudeau weakened. So they were playing both sides. It sounds like this is what the agenda is here.
Yeah, and this assessment said that China doesn't make a habit of interfering in elections generally the way the Russians do, but they will, when they feel like it's in their interest and there's a particular race that's relevant to them, they will play ball.
Let me bring in Courtney Kuby here. Let's talk about the military side of things with China. The intel community certainly thinks China is, I think one way to put it is, until China thinks it's on par with us militarily, they're not ready to go take Taiwan militarily. But how close are they?
Well, so the whole reason that the Pentagon put out the National Defense Strategy and identified China as what they keep calling the pacing challenge is to keep China from actually outpacing the U.S. militarily. So remember, China actually lays out their timeline on things. So 2027, they have set as the time where they plan to be ready to take Taiwan militarily. 2035 is when China identifies as the time that they should be fully modernized as a military and a defense force. So the U.S., knowing that, is continuing to work not to let them be outpaced. So, but if you were to look at where the U.S. is right now, theoretically, if the U.S. military stopped growing right now or sort of stood still, China would outpace them. And there are a couple of places that are particularly concerning for a lot of military and defense officials. One is hypersonics. I mean, the Chinese seem to be fielding them or able to field them if they want, whereas what we know about U.S. hypersonics is the U.S. is still much more in the testing phase of that. Now, keep in mind, both programs have classified components that we don't always know exactly how far along they are. But there are systems like that that do have people concerned in the Pentagon that China would be able to outpace. That, again, is why the U.S. is continuing to argue that they need to modernize the military and they need to keep advancing systems like that.
Courtney, how could China help Russia right now on the battlefield? What is it that Russia so desperately needs that China could be the game changer?
So a huge thing is ammunition. Both sides need ammunition, and that's not going to stop. As long as there is fighting, especially the kind of fighting that we've been seeing for the last 6 months or so on the battlefield, neither side is ever going to be able to have enough ammunition. And right now, artillery ammunition is particularly important. But it's not just that. If China were to throw its weight behind Russia with any kind of lethal aid, the symbolism of that would also would have an enormous impact on the conflict and then on the world, because people like the U.S., Western allies, would have to ask themselves, what can they do? Is there anything that they can do to stop that? We've already seen other actors like Iran really make an impact on the battlefield with their drones. Yeah. There's concerns that they may be providing they may look to provide other things like ballistic missiles that could be have a huge impact on the ground in Ukraine
Courtney,
if they
do we
went
think,
forward with that.
I had a fear that China was going to use Iran as a way to launder its contributions to Russia. Are we worried about that at all?
I would look more towards North Korea for that
As
potential.
the laundering aspect country for something like that? Okay.
There has been some concern that they could use they could use the North Koreans. I mean, there's also belief that the North Koreans may just be providing them things anyway for use in Ukraine. But absolutely, there's also, I mean, there's been some assessments that the Chinese and others may be trying to go through Middle Eastern countries to try to get equipment into Ukraine. So I think all of that is a very real concern.
Shane, the other part of this is there's apparently a belief in our intel community that Beijing wants to preserve a stable relationship with the United States. There's a part of me that wonders, are we being naive and hopeful there? Or is there, I mean, yes, we know they want it, but boy, hasn't that kind of been, we've been kind of relying on that practice now for a couple of decades?
Yeah, you hear a lot of diplomats, especially outside the United States, some of our close allies, expressing some skepticism about that, saying that, you know, China is on this so-called charm offensive, kind of backing down from some of the more bellicose rhetoric, the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy of recent years. But when I talk to them, they say, you know, the message may sound differently, but the meaning of it is not all that different. I mean, China's global strategic ambitions have not changed. Its aims on Taiwan have not really changed. Its desire to become on par with the United States militarily, technologically. None of that has really changed, even if the packaging seems a little bit softer. So I think that you're right to raise this question about whether we're being maybe a little bit too hopeful and thinking that somehow that China is just going to cede the field. And I got the feeling from this threat assessment that you know, the intelligence community is trying to very much put the public on warning about this right now.
The other thing I wanted to pick up is it looks like Taiwan's trying to turn down the temperature. Are they not, Shane? Like, if it's Taiwan's president and Speaker McCarthy, let's meet in the United States.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we all remember, you know, the furor that it created, you know, politically and militarily when Speaker Pelosi went over there. So I took note of that as well as saying, why don't we come to you? That might be a way of trying to lower the temperature.
I want one more round on China, and then I want to hit this Nord Stream thing with you, Shane. But apparently we in the United States, we don't have a lot of on-the-ground intelligence. And I guess, and we're fearful that the Chinese do in our country. That's another thing that seemed to come out of this.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. It's a closed society. There's a ton of surveillance. It's harder than ever to spy in China. More than 10 years ago, the U.S. lost a lot of its assets in a massive, catastrophic intelligence failure. What people tell us is they haven't really recovered. It's just a really tough place to spy, whereas we're an open society, accepting all these Chinese students coming to study here, all kinds of people.
I hear this about Iran. I'm now hearing this about China.
Yeah.
I've heard this about Russia. I mean, is this a problem in closed societies, or are we just not emphasizing that kind of intelligence work anymore?
Well, it's a problem with human intelligence generally in the age of technology. The days of spying in alias and going out from the embassy, posing as a diplomat, clandestine meetings at night, that's really difficult when there's cameras on every corner, biometrics, facial recognition. So spying has changed. Our digital spying is much better, and we're still very good at that.
Courtney, let me start with you. What is the Pentagon saying about Nord Stream pipeline before Shane's reporting?
They're not saying much of anything, frankly. They're, like the NSC, like the administration, the common refrain has been that this is not necessarily U.S. intelligence. They're turning to other allies and partners who are doing investigations on that. I mean, the Pentagon hasn't taken any real position one way or the other. So they're really pushing all the questions over to the intelligence community and to the NSC.
Shane, you know, when you hear people squealing, you know you've hit a spot here. This reporting. What's your level of confidence on this, and how concerned are they that this was Ukrainian sabotage?
Yeah, I think that I would not say that they have a high amount of confidence that it was definitively Ukrainian sabotage, but there are two things that are happening. One is there is no evidence that's conclusively tying the Nord Stream sabotage to Russia, and that includes evidence, frankly, that the U.S. intelligence community and its allies presume they would find, like evidence of Russian officials talking about having planned the attack on the pipeline. That's not there. What they are finding is a couple of things. One is there has been some intercepts after the fact of communications by what have been described to us as pro-Ukrainian individuals. It's not clear that this was intelligence collected by the U.S., in which they're overheard discussing before the attack a possibility of an attack on Nord Stream. And I would also just point to some really interesting reporting that came out in the past 24 hours from German media, including the newspaper Die Zeit, in which they have this very detailed claim about an operation involving half a dozen individuals with a yacht that was rented from a company in Poland. It's quite like a spy novel. Interestingly, the German prosecutor investigating the Nord Stream attack came out today and confirmed some of the details of that reporting, including that Germany believes that there was a boat rented that was used possibly, they say, to plant the explosives on this pipeline. That is distinct, it seems, from any kind of Russian government operation. So this is still gauzy. I want to be clear about this, but for quite some time now, talking to sources in the U.S. and elsewhere, they've been looking more towards Kyiv than towards Moscow as a possible source.
Is this, Shane, is it rogue Ukrainians or official?
I think that the belief right now is that this would be people operating without the direct knowledge or authorization of the central government. The question of how much officials in Kyiv know is a bit open right now. I should say they were emphatic to us and in public statements also, including Zelensky's top advisor, that they knew nothing about this.
Very quickly, Ken, has there been any concerns that there's some that there are some rogue Ukrainian forces out there sort of maybe pushing the envelope?
Well, one thing that's been clear is that, the U.S. doesn't control Ukraine. It's a wild card. There's a lot of questions about who's operating where. Well,
we know we've got our own sort of mercenaries that have shown up there, right? So we know there are probably some rogue bands of people that may be operating with their own sense of priorities and ethics. Ken Delaney, Courtney Cuby, Shane Harris. Terrific way to start with three great reporters on this important day, Worldwide Threat Day on Capitol Hill. So thank you all for that. Coming up, we're going to go with a deeper dive into the conflict with China, role of Congress. We have a member of the House Intel and China Select Committees joining us. It's the same person. Plus, how House Speaker McCarthy drove a wedge in the Republican Party over the unseen January 6 footage, and what it means for the future of the GOP and right-wing propaganda. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. As we mentioned earlier, the Director of National Intelligence told the Senate Intel Committee today that although China is the biggest threat to our national security, the U.S. Intel assessment is also that Beijing wants to avoid escalating tensions with Washington. The assessment comes despite China's new foreign minister warning yesterday that unless Washington changes course, the U.S. and China are heading toward, quote, confrontation and conflict. Well, joining me now is Republican Congressman Darin LaHood of Illinois. He's a member of the House Select Committee on China. He's also a member of the House Intel Committee. I told you, two committees, one guest. And they're going to have their own worldwide threats hearing tomorrow. So in some ways, Congressman, you get to sort of look at what the Senate did and fill in the gaps there. I could tell you one question I hope is asked, and that is sort of the level of danger in northern Mexico, which my understanding it's a pretty rough place compared to the rest of the globe these days. But let's start with China. And I thought the most startling admission was that China is looking to influence our politics and has decided if we can't influence Washington, we're going local. What do you make of that?
Well, I would say a couple things, Chuck. First of all, we have to remember China has a plan to replace the United States. And you heard Director Haynes reference this today, the challenges. But they're working economically, diplomatically, technologically, and militarily to replace the United States. Number two, the thing that the CCP fears the most is bipartisan support against the CCP. And what's great about this new Select Committee on China, it's bipartisan. Over 100 Democrats supported it on the House floor. Look at the makeup of the committee. Republicans and Democrats that are substantive, serious, taking this committee in a very professional way. And if you watched the hearing last week in prime time, Chuck, we had tremendous witnesses, but you really couldn't tell whether a Republican or Democrat was speaking most of the time. And I really look at this as not a Republican or Democrat issue, it's an American issue. And I'm glad we have this Select Committee and looking forward to the opportunities to expose the malign activities of the CCP, but also look at significant policy solutions on helping the United States in our competition.
Do you think our economic ties, our leverage, are the kind of leverage that China might respond to?
Well, I think you got a couple things on that. One is when we brought China into the World Trade Organization in 2001, the argument at the time was they're going to modernize, they're going to liberalize, they're going to become more like us. Clearly that hasn't happened, and so there were mistakes made on bringing them into the global trading network, right? They've manipulated the system in many ways. To your question, this is not the Cold War with Russia, because we are intertwined economically at every level with China. We have to remember that. But I do think that we can work with our like-minded allies in the Indo-Pacific region. China, Korea, they are craving our economic leadership over there. Indonesia, the Philippines. And what we ought to do is, I also serve on the Ways and Means Committee, we ought to use our trade framework to build a network of rules-based systems to isolate China. And that's frankly part of what we'll deal with on the Select Committee on China, and that will put us at an advantage.
I'm old enough to remember something called the TPP. What you're describing there, Congressman, is that, that was the whole supposed initial idea of the Trans-Pacific Partnership until Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump basically used it as a wedge and both parties backed away. Was that a mistake?
Well, listen, it wasn't perfect, Chuck, but it set that framework for isolating China. I think you got to take the initiative that we had with TPP and we got to change it and adapt it. Frankly, if you look at what we put in USMCA, a bipartisan trade agreement with Mexico and Canada, I think we have to look at that as a framework and figure out how we get with our like-minded allies. But to be honest with you, Chuck, the Biden administration has done nothing over the last 2 years when it comes to trade or working with our like-minded allies in the Indo-Pacific region. I think that will change with a Republican majority now, and it has to as part of our Select Committee on China.
Well, you say that assuming that somehow Republicans are more pro-free trade. They're not anymore. I mean, this seems to be a divide inside both parties these days about whether to use trade in this way, which in the past has been a very successful national security tool.
Well, you're right about that. I mean, I think the dynamics have changed, particularly as it relates to China. Are we going to let them write the rules of the road when it comes to trade in the Indo-Pacific region, or are we going to exercise our priorities? And we, frankly, haven't done that. I think we got to work with our allies in Western Europe and to other democracies and rules-based system in an economic way. And again, that's going to be a big topic, hopefully in a bipartisan way, with our Select Committee on China.
Look, I know no politician likes a hypothetical, but if our intelligence community finally gets enough information to assess that China lied to the world about COVID, right? Maybe it was naturally occurring, they studied it in a lab, it leaked out, whatever it is, but they didn't tell the truth. What should the consequences be? What are the consequences for something like that? There's one thing to pound our fist on the table, but what's the punishment?
Well, it's really a trust issue, because remember when COVID first broke out, remember what the Chinese said? They blamed it on the U.S. military, Chuck. That was their initial response. They did not cooperate with the World Health Organization. I would argue they've been deceitful at every level with their COVID deaths and everything else. So you cannot trust them. And, we heard the Department of Energy report this week. We heard what Director Wray said on the allegations or the evidence that shows that most likely it came from Wuhan. I think there has to be consequence of that. Remember this, too, Chuck.
Would you support lawsuits? I say this, remember, that's what we did with, you had civilians sued Saudi Arabia. And then Saudi Arabia wanted to be indemnified from those lawsuits post 9/11. Would that be a way to punish China?
Well, I think that could take way too long. But again, I think you have to expose what they engaged in here, which is becoming clearer and clearer. But think about this. We had over 1 million people die in this country. How do you prevent a future pandemic when you don't know the genesis of this one? Yeah. That's the bottom line. And we need to tell everybody in the world that and expose China for what they didn't do here.
A couple of quick political things. Speaker McCarthy said he gave the January 6 footage to Tucker Carlson first for transparency purposes. Do you agree with that decision?
Well, I'm glad they were released. They should have been released. I'm all for transparency and openness. The speaker deciding who he wants to give that to is his own prerogative. But as you know, Chuck, these videos and tapes are going to go to...
It's its own prerogative. I mean, that's not the definition of transparency in this case.
Well, we can quarrel about who you give it to first, but everybody's going to have access to these tapes and what happened. But I would say this. Obviously, there were over 125 police officers that were injured and hurt as part of 9/11. I'm sorry, as part of January 6th. And I've said that was a terrible day for democracy. But I'm glad they were released.
Do you agree with the Capitol Police Chief, who said called Tucker Carlson's broadcast offensive and misleading?
Well, again, I'm not going to get into what somebody else said about somebody else. I wasn't a part of that. Again, I'm glad they're being released. We need more transparency in this process.
Did you think January 6th was a violent attack?
Listen, I publicly said at the time that it was a terrible day for our democracy, a black eye on our, our system of government, and we ought to learn from it.
Congressman Darin LaHood, as I said, you'll see a lot of them these days. China Select Committee, House Intel Committee tomorrow, that threats hearing. It is one of those hearings that every American should tune into once a year. Congressman, thanks for coming on and sharing your perspective with us.
Thank you.
Up next, what the latest Republican rift tells us about House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, Donald Trump, Fox, and some very toxic political forces in American politics. Panel's next. And we took a deep dive, by the way, into the future of the Republican Party heading into 2024 and beyond in today's episode of the Chuck Toddcast. Get to know Ron DeSantis and this Republican legislature that he will be controlling for the next 4 months. It's available wherever you get your podcasts. You're watching Meet the Press Now.
Take any part in whitewashing January 6th. It wasn't a stroll through the Capitol. It was an attack on our Capitol.
Efforts to try and pretend that it was something other than that are despicable and frankly dangerous, because it makes it more likely that people will think things like this are acceptable, and they might try and do them in the future. It's simply, it's awful what some people are willing to do to get some eyeballs or get a little extra money.
Welcome back. More Republicans today expressing their outrage at how Fox News' Tucker Carlson is falsely portraying the violent attack on the Capitol as a, quote, mostly peaceful gathering. Late yesterday, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy defended his decision to turn over thousands of hours of footage from January 6th to a single person, Tucker Carlson, though he admitted he has not seen how Carlson used the footage. Here's McCarthy.
What? I don't know what Tucker
He said it was mostly peaceful chaos.
Well, that's what you said. I don't know what Tucker Carlson said. I continue to hold that my job here, just like I was asked long before, is to make sure all the transparency comes out. And that's exactly what I'm doing. And just like all of you cover news, people are able to interpret the way they want. But I think the fairest way to do it, instead of trying to clip it or do something else, allow all the transparency so everybody can see.
Unsurprisingly, former President Donald Trump is cheering Carlson's selective editing and deceptive description of the footage. In a series of online posts, Trump said all January 6 defendants should be exonerated and that the House committee members that probed the January 6 attack should be tried for treason. Treason. I know we all write off what Donald Trump says on this crazy social media platform that most people are not. But he is the one authoring this stuff, the current frontrunner for the 2024 Republican nomination. Trump also thanked McCarthy profusely for giving the footage to Carlson. All of this is an unsettling place to be, 2 years after an insurrection, to have a major broadcast company and top leaders of a major political party knowingly trafficking in disinformation. It's clear what a powerful force Trump remains in the party, because this is all for the benefit of him, a toxic political figure who the leaders inside both the GOP and Fox seem to agree, at least behind closed doors, represents a threat to the future of U.S. democracy, and they're both afraid to deal with it. Joining me now on set, Audrey Fahlberg, campaigns and Congress reporter for The Dispatch, Eugene Robinson, Washington Post columnist, as well as an NBC News political analyst, and Republican strategist Matt Gorman. Audrey, let me start with you, which is, Kevin McCarthy keeps falling back on this idea that he's being transparent. He's yet to give this to any other members of the media. It certainly looks like this was simply fulfilling a promise he had to do to get the gavel.
Certainly that was part of the speaker deal. As a campaign reporter, I try to look at these things from an electoral perspective, right? Today, I'm thinking of the more vulnerable House Republicans who are constantly getting asked questions about this from reporters in the Capitol. They know that January 6th revisionism, any talk of January 6th in general, is extremely politically toxic at the ballot box, particularly with independents and suburban voters. They want to talk about crime, inflation. So from that perspective, obviously, they're probably extremely frustrated with McCarthy about this.
You know, Matt, the first rule of being a leader of a political party is don't divide your own party. It seems like Kevin McCarthy violated this. I mean, he has brought an issue back that the whole party in Congress was trying to compartmentalize, and for the most part kind of had, until he brought it back.
He divided the House and the Senate, but if you notice, Audrey, you kind of alluded to this, folks like Don Bacon, those blue Biden district Dems, but it's mostly coming from the Senate, right? I think they understand to an extent that to hold the team together in advance of a debt limit fight, in advance of some of these more controversial things. McCarthy needed to do this a little bit. And look, I think McCarthy's view, if I'm him, it's, look, I'm willing to be a little patient, do this now, take the hit, to try and, you know, be able to fight another day when it comes to debt limit or other things.
All right, but if this is the awkward thing, and Gina, it's like I'm giving you a layup here, but Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger were drummed out of the party for investigating January 6th.
Exactly.
And there are no consequences for somebody basically doing revisionism, you know.
Yeah, I mean, just telling lies about January 6th and selectively taking a little tidbit here and a little
You know, the
snippet
Germans
there.
and the Brits played soccer with each other during World War I and then fought each other. How would Tucker Carlson have reported that? I mean, you know.
I know, exactly. It wasn't actually a great war. It was it was a soccer match. I mean, it's, you know, it's crazy. I generally don't like a whole lot of news covering news. You know, news people because that's navel gazing.
Our meeting this morning. We had a huge.
But you can't. You can't say what Tucker Carlson is doing is news. I mean, it's politics. It's not news. It's propaganda. And so it's something that you have to cover. And it's shameful. It's disgusting, and it's dangerous. It really is.
Isn't this a reminder of just how powerful of a force Donald Trump still is in the party? If he weren't a powerful force, would this even be an issue?
I think that's a great point. You know, seeing Trump's comments thanking Tucker Carlson for airing this footage is a reminder that, you know, he's constantly relitigating the events of the past, whether that's January 6th or the 2020 election. That's why it's interesting to see, you know, other folks like Ron DeSantis not focusing on events that happened in the past, but focusing on his record and saying we need to move forward and really talk about issues that matter to independents, like crime and inflation, high grocery prices, that kind of thing.
Matt, this is what I keep coming back to. It just feels like it does seem as if, for all the talk, all the parties getting ready to move on from Trump, Trump is still the animating force. He is, and even like people that think he's a threat. I mean, we saw the behind the scenes from Fox sort of show it. It's the same thing. People say one thing, whisper to you one thing on the Senate halls, and then publicly say he's the greatest president in my lifetime.
Yeah, look, I think a couple things. I think I would actually say him praising Carlson and him trying to throw around the word treason to get some headlines. It's him chasing headlines, and no longer is he, I think, the one setting them, right? He's praising he's praising a cable news host where, you know, but I also think, though, too, and I've said this repeatedly, if you want to defeat Trump, you do it at the ballot box, right? And I think,
agree with that.
You know, and one of the things, Echelon came out with a poll yesterday, Republican voters, primary voters, focus now on more winning. I think that's not electability. I think electability always doesn't really play in a primary. I think it's winning over new voters, winning the election, then winning over Congress. I think that's why you hear DeSantis, but that's also why you hear people focused in the future, Haley, Tim Scott, and the like.
Well, yeah. I mean, Haley and Tim Scott and DeSantis, and they would all love for the party to be future-focused. But right now, the leading candidate for the nomination is Donald Trump, and he is out there, and he is not going to go away until somebody makes him go away. Sure, he's just simply not going to go away.
Sure, but I will say this. I was even surprised, right? A lot of Trump's CPAC speech was future-focused. You can certainly disagree with a lot of it, but he has come back to the January 6th and the 2020, but that, I think most folks would agree, even his own team's like, that's not going to win. But look, what is it, March? I work for Jeb Bush, right? We're going to know in 8 months whether we're Trump now, right? Like he's former president of the United States in March.
It's very early, it's this and that. But I pretty much guarantee that the sort of premise of his campaign is going to be that I actually won in 2020. The election was stolen from me. And this is an article of faith that I'm going to expect people to sign on.
Then DeSantis will turn in and be like, look, regardless of what anyone thinks about 2020, Joe Biden is the president right now. There's an election coming up next November, or whomever will say this. That's what we need to do. We need to defeat Joe Biden.
Audrey, let me ask you this. How does the party navigate this Fox issue? And I say it this way. On one hand, they don't have to. They can't afford, if you're the eventual Republican nominee, and let's just talk generically, if an association with a Fox News host turns off swing voters, that's not a good thing. And right now, it does feel like Fox is getting marginalized into an extreme fringe bucket thanks to Tucker.
I think this is a tricky issue for Republicans to navigate. As you mentioned, Matt, you know, Senate Republicans are coming out a little bit more strongly than House Republicans, saying,
well, they face statewide electorates. So they actually have independents that they have to win.
Right, exactly. Saying, you know, that day, what happened was a very dark day in American history, a dark day for the Republican Party. I covered the complex, outside of the complex that day. It was it was a riot, indisputably. And so I think Senate Republicans are kind of treading that line well. But, when House Republicans are up every 2 years, and when some of the louder voices in the Republican Party who don't really have to answer to those independent voters, that's when it gets a little bit tricky.
I mean, it's not going to be helpful if Marjorie Taylor Greene and James Comer are doing prisoner visits to January 6th. Folks, are they? This is the Republican Party's messaging.
Comer's one of the most fascinating folks on the Republican side right now. I mean, he's been
We're all trying to figure this out.
He's been on the Sunday version of this. I mean, I was on when he was on, and we talked about it. He wouldn't mention Hunter Biden, right? He avoided that question. I think kind of connecting both of these things. Conservative media, it's a Republican primary, as it should be kind of that #1 audience. But what I'm interested to see is what Republicans running for president can fill a vacuum of more mainstream outlets. Is it Lester? Is it somebody else? Because there's a lot of conservative eyeballs still among those lot of eyeballs.
Well,
absolutely.
But we can see the reverse. There's arguably Democrats are still answering for some of the more progressive things that were forced upon the presidential campaign in 2020.
Absolutely.
Right? The party still. This is what I think is going to damage the Republican field even more so because of how much there's so many candidates who want to embrace this wing of the party.
Well, exactly. And so candidates are going to have to make a decision. They're going to have to decide, how they're going to play this. Basically, are they going to go on with the Trump version, or are they going to go on with the true version of what happened? And Fox is going to have to make some decisions, too. I mean, Fox is going to, as it goes forward and decide.
Do they?
Because,
only if
look,
they're losing
apparently this is how they think of what they do, right? They think of the impact, eyeballs first, the impact on their numbers, the number of eyeballs, and what they need to do to keep that number up and to keep their people engaged with Fox. And so they're going to have to decide whether that's going with, the Trump version or with the DeSantis version.
Audrey, Kristen Sununu used a phrase that has always been the phrase that I've always believed in for Republican nomination fights, which is Republicans try to nominate the most electable conservative. Not the person that's the most popular with the middle, but the person that can still win the middle and appease conservatives, right? It's that somewhat conservative lane. Does that exist right now? Or has Trump sort of made it impossible to straddle that?
I think it's tricky because he has this grasp on this, 30-35% of the Republican primary electorate. And it's hard to knock off even 5 or 10% of that.
There's no chipping away at it, is it? It's like one block.
And it's interesting to see how candidates are chipping away at it. Nikki Haley, polling really in single digits, trying to hit him on the age question with the competency test over the age of 75, all politicians, whereas Ron DeSantis is constantly going back to his own record, taking veiled shots at Trump, not saying him, calling him out by name, not even attending CPAC, but...
Well, if you can use a tack hammer, you're not going to chip away at it. A sledgehammer, maybe.
And even then on a block ice, it takes a lot of swings. Let me tell you, Audrey, Eugene, and Matt, lively discussion, so thank you for that. After the break, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin's trip to Israel delayed over security concerns. Massive protests and a spate of deadly violence are roiling the region. We're going to report on there, but first, today is International Women's Day. President Biden issued a statement in honor of the day, calling for women to have an equal seat at the table. Across the country today, women are marching to make their voices heard on issues such as abortion and human rights. So in honor of the great women in our history, here's Eleanor Roosevelt on Meet the Press in 1957, and talking about when she thought the U.S. could expect to see a female president.
On this program last week, you were suggested as a possible candidate for president yourself.
For what?
For president. For the nomination.
I am 73 years old. Wake up.
I didn't make the nomination. Do you think we shall ever have a woman president?
Yes, of course we will.
How soon?
Oh, I don't know how soon. That depends on how many women do well in offices and how many women win offices and are appointed. You can't tell, but someday it will happen when you get to the point where you look at people in politics and in positions of political importance as people and not as either women or men.
Are there women today who could be president of the United States, Mrs. Roosevelt?
I've never given it much thought, but I'm sure there probably are.
Welcome back. The U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin is delaying his trip to Tel Aviv today due to planned protests across Israel. At the request of the Israeli government, Austin will instead travel to Israel tomorrow morning, and he's going to meet with Israeli leadership near the airport rather than the Ministry of Defense in Tel Aviv. Just think about that fact alone, folks. Secretary Austin is expected to call for the de-escalation of violence between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. Yesterday, 6 Palestinians were killed during a raid in the West Bank. Our foreign correspondent, Ralph Sanchez, is based in Tel Aviv, and he has more with this report.
Chuck, Secretary Austin's plans to visit Israel have been completely scrambled by the domestic political crisis here. As we've talked about before, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, his new right-wing government, are trying to ram through this very controversial plan to weaken Israel's Supreme Court. Netanyahu says this is a necessary reform to curb activist judges. But tens of thousands of Israelis have been out on the streets in recent weeks protesting against it. They fear this is a potentially fatal blow to Israeli democracy because under this plan, Israel's parliament could vote by a simple majority to simply ignore rulings of the Supreme Court. Now, protesters will be out on the streets on Thursday blocking major highways, and that has totally overturned Secretary Austin's original plan, which was to come here to Tel Aviv to meet his Israeli counterpart at Israel's defense ministry. Instead, he's going to fly into Israel's Ben Gurion airport, do his meetings there, and fly out without ever leaving the airport compounds. Now, in terms of the substance of those meetings, Secretary Austin is flying into what is one of the bloodiest periods in Israel and the occupied West Bank in 20 years. Just yesterday, Israeli special forces raided the Jenin refugee camp in the northern West Bank. They killed 6 Palestinian militants, including a senior Hamas operative who they say was responsible for the murder of 2 Israeli brothers. Secretary Austin trying to leverage American influence to bring some calm to this situation. We're expecting him to urge the Israelis to scale back these military raids in the daytime, because that leads to a situation where you have Israeli forces confronting these very large, angry Palestinian crowds, and you often end up with a lot of people killed as a result. We're also expecting the secretary to call on the Palestinian security forces to do more to confront militant groups themselves so the Israelis don't have to continue these raids into Palestinian cities. Chuck?
Ralph Sanchez, who is reporting in Tel Aviv for us. Ralph, thank you. Still to come, the Senate is set to block a new D.C. crime bill minutes from now in a controversial vote that sparked a local and national debate over crime and policing. The president of the National Urban League is going to join me on set. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. The issues of crime and policing are back in the spotlight here in Washington, D.C. Just minutes from now, the Senate is scheduled to vote to block a controversial slate of criminal code reforms, which would have reduced some penalties for some offenses in the city of Washington from becoming law here in Washington, D.C. The vote comes even as district officials at the last minute try to pull the legislation from being considered. Democratic lawmakers, including Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, are now expected to back the Republican-led bill. President Biden said that he would not veto it earlier this week as he tries to preempt some Republican critiques that Democrats are soft on crime. The vote comes as the Department of Justice just revealed in its own investigation a pattern of civil rights violations and unconstitutional policing by the Louisville Police Department. Attorney General Merrick Garland spoke about the agency's findings earlier today.
Some officers have demonstrated disrespect for the people they are sworn to protect. Some have videotaped themselves throwing drinks at pedestrians from their cars, insulted people with disabilities, and called black people monkeys, animal, and boy. This conduct is unacceptable. It is heartbreaking. It erodes the community trust necessary for effective policing, and it is an affront to the vast majority of officers who put their lives on the line every day.
This investigation came in the aftermath of the death of Breonna Taylor in the botched no-knock warrant raid, the use of which are also condemned in the report itself. I'm joined now by Mark Morrell. He's a former mayor himself of the city of New Orleans, and he's, of course, the president of the National Urban League.
Good to be with you, Chuck.
It's good to see you. Let me start with Louisville and sort of how this Justice Department is doing on this front. And how many cities do you think could withstand the scrutiny that Louisville got?
I think many cities could not withstand the scrutiny that Louisville got. And what this is a reflection of the fact that Merrick Garland, along with Vanita Gupta and Kristen Clark, are using their full powers in the face of obstinance in Congress to passing a true police reform bill to reform systemically policing. I mean, I think people may be stunned, but I say to mayors all the time, when you take office, you better audit your police department. You better look comprehensively because there may be a lot going on that you will only become aware of in the event of a crisis. So this, if you will, pattern and practice report, this investigation, we asked for it. I'm glad it's come.
You only get these, though, after there's a major incident in a major police department. You don't get these, we don't do these preemptively, and I understand that, but I wonder if there is a better way.
There is a better way, and the better way is for local governments, for mayors, to affirmatively conduct their own examinations of their police departments. Nothing stops a police department,
yearly audit,
mayor,
2 years audit, something like that, make it a regular thing?
To do an independent review. Yeah. I mean, we did many in New Orleans that led to our own reforms. We did reforms without the necessity of an investigation or consent decree.
Let's talk about being a mayor right now. It's hardest, nothing
tough
easy
job,
about,
always.
especially post-COVID. It seems you've got economic challenges, you've got this homeless crisis, downtowns are empty. What is step one here? I mean, it does seem as if mayors and the business community need to get on the same page of work from home.
I think it is important that mayors and the business community lead on the economic future. So in some cities, it may mean that you've got to convert downtown what has historically been office buildings to affordable housing, to work, and, if you will, live spaces.
So if you were Muriel Bowser here, you'd be going, okay, so downtown D.C., you know, we don't have as many potbellies, but maybe we should convert these office buildings to housing.
No, I think she's right. She should prevail on the federal government to bring its office workers back to work.
You would bring them back to work?
I would bring them back at least 2 days a week, 3 days a week. I think there's a middle ground here, Chuck. I lead an organization. We are back 3 days a week, 2 days from home. You cannot, I feel, be effective if all of your workforce is working from home.
But I focus on this first because I feel like this crime issue and the lack of people in downtowns and the homeless crisis are all connected.
They, in some ways, are connected, but the solution to all of them may not necessarily be interconnected.
Okay.
If you bring your office workers back, if you bring them back, you're going to help small businesses, it's going to assist your tax base, and you're going to improve the quality of life in all of your neighborhoods. So I think it's important that this be done. But here's the thing. We're in a brave new world, the post-COVID world. No one anticipated the spike in violence that we speak. But absent in all of this discussion is the fact that we've got more guns on the streets, more guns than we have American people. We have a mental health crisis on top of it, and we have a systemic challenge when it comes to police and communities trusting police.
Let's talk about this policing issue. I had Muriel Bowser on last week, and you know she's trying to hire cops. She can't find enough cops. Everybody in Chicago is pledging more cops. Okay, where are you going to find them? It's one thing to say you want more cops on the street, finding good cops. There's a lot of reasons, Chuck, that we can't find good cops.
And look, let me say this. Every major city has vacancies when it comes to its police department. So on one hand, is it the pay? On the other hand, is it the working conditions? But on the third hand, what you also hear from young people is, I don't want to be associated with a job or a department that takes advantage of people, that beats up people.
Some people think it's an unpopular job to have, like people won't respect you.
It's a tough and a difficult job, but this is why, and I'll point out Newark and some other communities, you have to also think anew about how you police. You've got to redefine public safety. You've got to look at strategies that may not include law enforcement and policing. You can't just handcuff yourself if you cannot hire police. You've got to try to do other things. And I like unarmed dispute resolution, if you will, units. I like the idea of utilizing social workers and mental health experts to respond to those calls for service that do not necessarily require law enforcement. We've got to redefine this because this problem of the inability to hire policing is not going to go away soon.
No, it does feel like it's a huge challenge. Mark Burrell, I'm glad you came in. Good to see you. Head of the National Urban League, former mayor of New Orleans. That's all we have for this hour. I'll be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
We'll come back, man.
Are you...
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.